Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumEtSpes22.com, Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I'm back up in it, into the podcasting, back from Rome, all that stuff. Everybody knows that now. I'm I'm thrilled to have a guest today who's actually been a guest blogger on my blog a couple of times, and also someone I've known on social media for a very long time, 5 years or so now, if that counts as on social media standards, Philippa. I think that does count as a long time, 5 years. But I'm talking about the one, the only, Dr. Phillipa Martyr from Australia. So welcome to the show.
Hi, Larry. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, it's 8 o'clock at night here. It's 8 o'clock in the morning for you. I can recommend Thursday. It was a great day, so just feel free to dive into it and enjoy it. And I'll be putting Thursday behind me now. So yes, thank you so much, and thank
Yeah.
you also for letting me blog on your blog, as it were. I mean, that's really how we first came across each other. I was reading your stuff, and I thought he thinks like I do. How fantastic! So I sent you some stuff, and you were kind enough to put it on your
Yeah.
blog, and of course, that went straight to my head. And after that, there was no
Well, you
holding me
write
back.
for
So
other
yeah,
venues too. I've seen your
I
stuff
do.
everywhere. You're a prolific writer. You are an excellent writer. That was the first thing
Thank
that
you.
caught my attention, and the reason was just how good your writing is. It's not only insightful writing, but it's got it's clear, but it also has a certain punch to it. It's very descriptive, and that's kind of what struck me, which is why I invited you to do it. But that brings me to the point here when talking about your. Oh, by the way, we should mention to introduce Dr. Phillipa Martyr. She's an adjunct research fellow, School of Philosophy and Theology of the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and an external affiliate of the Benedictine 16 Center for Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, St. Mary's University in Twickenham, UK. I've never been in Twickenham, UK. I assume that it's a lovely place.
I have never been to Twickenham either. You'll have to ask my colleague, Professor Stephen Bullivant, because that's where his campus is. So that's
Oh, Steve
that
Bullivant. I've
he's
had him on the show.
yes,
I
yes,
love him.
yes,
He is one of
yes.
my favorite people to interview. Stephen, if you're watching this, and I'm sure you're not, but let's do another show. He's just so
Stephen,
delightful.
yeah, yeah. He is the Benedict the 16th Center for Religion and thingamie what's it,
Very
you know,
good.
so
That's
that's
what
yeah,
that's
yeah.
about. Okay, so we're talking about Philippa Martyr's new book, Witness: The Future Catholic Church in Australia. Philippa Martyr, and the publisher is Connor Court Publishing, and
Yep.
it fresh off the press 2025. As soon as I saw on Facebook or Twitter or wherever it was that this book had been published, I got a hold of you or you got a hold of me, and I said, "Send me a copy." And it actually came relatively quickly. I thought it would take longer coming from Australia, but it didn't. It came quickly.
It's available on Amazon in the US, so you can actually get it really fast.
And I found that out. So I have to confess, I've only read about half of it. I read some of it on the plane to and from Rome, but I had to read other books, getting ready for other podcasts. That's the, before we get into your book, I'll say something about podcasting. One thing I cannot stand, and one reason why I don't watch a lot of podcasts, is when an interviewer has a guest on who has a new book out. And it's very clear the interviewer has never read the book, doesn't have a clue about the book. And so essentially it's just saying to the guest, please tell us about this wonderful book that I've never read. And I think that's just fundamentally dishonest. And
Oh,
so,
look.
so when I do a podcast, I do like to at least, if with an author who's written a book, to at least read huge chunks of it so that I have a sense of the book. Because my podcast, I don't just want to interview someone; I want to have a conversation with them. And how can I have a conversation if I haven't at least read big parts of the book? So
It's fine,
that's
Larry. We were overtaken by events. You know, no one expected Francis to die when he did, etc., etc.
oh
So
God, I
that's
tell you,
fine.
that really. I had planned all
Yeah.
these publications, wanted me to
Mm,
go and cover the
mm.
thing in Rome. And then, boy, I was out in Nebraska, the American Midwest, visiting my
Yeah, yeah,
family, and woke up Monday morning. It's like, oh God, I got to get a plane now. And so
yeah,
anyway, let's
yeah.
get to your book. Uh,
Yes.
let me start with a kind of cheeky question. Why should anybody outside of Australia care about the church in Australia?
Man, because we're in so much doo-doo. I mean, we are really in a big steaming pile of it, Larry. And if you want to know what happens when you take your hands off the wheel of the diocesan parochial church, this is where you end up. You end up here. Now,
Yeah,
look, I know you guys can look just across the border at Canada. You will see a very similar picture to the church in Australia. South Africa, New Zealand, or we're one of those English-speaking countries where the church has just tanked and we are in a huge amount of trouble. And I mean, Mark Stein sums it up. It's the demography, stupid. You know, we are facing an absolute demographic winter in this country. And unfortunately, our episcopate has not been super respondent to that as of yet. So I wrote the book partly to try and bring all of the information we have about that, put it in the one place, and give it to whoever wants to read it. And it's almost like a cautionary tale. So I don't know if
yeah.
you've ever seen that the demotivational poster where it says your purpose in life may simply be to serve as an example to other people. That's what the church in Australia
Right. Yeah.
that's the situation we're in here. It's really bad.
Yeah. So that's what, when I was reading your book, that's what I kept thinking to myself was, okay, so only, as you point out in the book, only about 400,000 Catholics bother to attend Mass even
Yeah,
somewhat regularly in Australia. And so when I was reading, I'm going, if I'm going to interview her about this, I need to find out why what happens in Australia is significant for those outside of Australia. And what I came upon in my own brain was, well, yeah, because number one, you should just care about Australian Catholics because they're Catholics, they're human beings, but also that's a canary in the coal mine. The
yeah,
United
yeah,
States is not always true, not always, but usually, culturally, religiously, the United States lags behind the rest of the Anglo world by about 10 or 15 years. Now that may be accelerating now with
yeah,
social media. But what happens in Canada, in the Anglo part of Canada, what happens in Australia, what happens in the UK in general, what happens in Ireland actually does eventually, the American tend to follow eventually because the internal metaphysical logic and sociological logic of what has happened in those countries is working in the United States. It's got something to do with the peculiar American conservative strain that sort of acts as a check against some of that. But in many ways, it's just kind of inevitable. So let's go back to your comment. And this is what happens when you take your hands off the parochial wheel. Let's examine, because you talk a lot about that in the book. So what do you mean by that?
Okay, what we've done in the Australian church is, well, demographically, we've done something really dumb, but that took a very long time. That took about 100 years, in that Catholics in Australia started limiting their family size actually way before Vatican II. And no one realized this till I found this really old study that had been done based on the Australian census, where you could actually look at the number of babies that a Catholic woman had. And the family size had halved in the first half of the 20th century. So this is before Humanae Vitae. So I think Humanae Vitae in Australia kind of, it was, the damage was already done, and all it did was kind of speed things up. So we've got this shrunken family situation that's been really bad. So there's far fewer of us. The second thing that we did wrong in Australia, and we did this really well, was that we started marrying non-Catholics. And
Yeah.
it is extraordinary the difference that that has made. I think the difference that that has made, I think it's a measurable difference you can actually see because, we know the church didn't like us marrying non-Catholics because the children tend not to go to Mass. One parent tends not to go to Mass, all good reasons. So until about 1970, when the church actually changed its ruling on this, the rate of mixed, in inverted commas, marriages in Australia was about 21%. After 1970, it went up to nearly 50%. In fact, it went higher. Round about 2000, it's been dropping ever since then. Catholics are now marrying Catholics again, but it might be too little too late. I don't know. We have to wait and see what's going to happen. These two things, these two enormous factors, smaller family size and the whole marrying out kind of thing, none of our bishops ever talk about this. What happened instead in the 90s was that was probably the worst period for the Catholic Church in Australia in terms of politics in the church. And our Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference was probably at its lowest ebb at that point, and in the hands of the worst kind of people, the kind of people you would not want to be running the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. And the whole push was like, we've got to change the church's teaching. People are not coming to Mass because we haven't ordained women. They don't want to come to Mass because it's boring, and all of this other kind of stuff. No one looked at the demography. No one looked at those big trends that were happening. So it was very easy for them to get derailed and start pushing for every kind of nonsense, none of which helped, of course. The other thing that was happening, Larry, and this is really funny, I find this hugely funny that I'm the first person to really notice this. People were dying in the Catholic Church in Australia, and no one factored that in to our mass attendance rate. So it's like, oh no, look, the mass attendance rate is
Yeah.
tanking because we haven't ordained women and we haven't, done X, Y, and Z. Actually, people were dying. We had this really top heavy structure of old people. They were dying faster than the young people, and they weren't being replaced. None of our bishops have talked about this. They've had all the data to talk about this, but none of them are talking about it because I guess it's more fun to talk about ordaining women and, all of that kind of stuff. But none of that will actually help turn us around. So this is what I mean by taking your hands off the wheel when you have actually all the information in front of you to make good decisions, and you're just ignoring it because maybe you don't understand it, or maybe it's been kept from you. I don't know. So that that's been the biggest, taking the hands off the wheel. There is another where we've really, I think, misplaced our focus, and that is in Australia. I don't know what it's like really in the United States because I know your healthcare system is different from ours, and your education
To
system
say the
is
least.
different. I know you don't have a healthcare system. We do. We have a government funded one, like the NHS in England. Um, Catholic corporations started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So Catholic schools and Catholic hospitals and healthcare, all of which were getting lots of taxpayers' money, started to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And today they are absolutely multi-billion-dollar industries in Australia, but they're running on taxpayers' money. So this is the church says it's running these things, but actually it's not. The Australian taxpayer is actually paying everybody's salaries and getting all of the work done. And yet for public relations purposes, these are always pushed out at us, and we're told, oh, look, we employ 100,000 people in our education system, and we employ 80,000 people in our healthcare system, and we're providing all of these services, and it's wonderful. But Larry, people are paying really good money for those services. We're not offering them free to people. We're not
Yeah.
looking for the
Yeah.
poor and offering them these wonderful, the way Catholic healthcare started in the olden days was, you'd look after poor people and what have you. I can't
Well,
afford to go to a Catholic hospital.
The Catholic
Mm.
Church invented the hospital in its modern
Yes, yeah,
Western iteration,
yeah,
in it through its
yes,
monasteries and so forth, in the remnants of the Roman Empire. And it
yeah,
was to aid the
absolutely.
poor. It was to help people who didn't have access. Now, one imagines that it involved leeches and all kinds of strange conco concoctions.
Yeah,
Here, drink this mercury. It'll make you feel better. Uh,
yes, yes. Or cure your
but
syphilis, but
still,
you may also die.
still, the monks had, in fact, developed some rather sophisticated medicinal tools. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. You're right. I mean, we should be focusing on the evangelical counsels, the Sermon on the Mount. You know, give until it hurts. The poor, the poor, the poor.
Yeah,
Isn't that going to the peripheries? Isn't that smelling like the sheep, as our late Holy Father has said? But no, you're right. And this is why it's so important what's going on in Australia, because it's a
yeah,
mirror image of what's coming in the United States. Because
yeah,
our Catholic hospital systems and Catholic charities are bloated with taxpayer money,
yeah,
bloated
yeah,
with it. And
yeah,
we too are undergoing a demographic winter. In some ways, thank God that our immigration crisis does not involve and I'm not saying this to be racist. I'm saying this to be a bit anti-Muslim. It doesn't involve millions and millions of Muslims coming into the country. It involves
Yeah,
mainly Latinos coming from Central America, Mexico. So at least we're not under the threat of a complete demographic implosion in the sense that we've got this infusion of new blood. But if you look at the birth rate of native, Americans, as such, legal American Catholics, woo, it's cratered. It's
yes, yes,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely
yeah,
cratered. And by the way, my
yeah,
statement about
yeah,
Islam, I'm not here to, say, oh, don't let Muslims into the country. I'm saying if you look at, I was just in Rome and stuff, where you see Italy is completely now. I mean, there is a danger of cultural displacement, and there's a narrative we can have there, a question about does this represent, and we can talk about this in the Australian context as well. And I know I'm getting off topic, but it's on my brain a lot lately, having been in
yeah,
Rome.
yeah,
Do
yeah,
the waves after waves and you see protests in Ireland right now of Muslim immigrants from, Arab countries, Middle Eastern countries. And so does it represent a unique opportunity for evangelization, or does it represent the complete collapse of the last remnants of Christianity in Europe, United States, Australia, places like that?
yeah.
And so I think that's an open and burning question because I tend
Mm,
to be
no, yeah,
pro-immigration. I tend to be
mm,
pro-open borders because I'm a Catholic worker kind of guy. But
mm,
I understand also the need for cultural stability and cultural preservation, and I certainly don't want the Christian faith undermined. So these are
yeah,
delicate
absolutely.
questions. But anyway, go ahead. You can talk about
No,
that
no,
perhaps.
yeah, we've got similar problems here. Historically, I've always been a small L liberal in terms of immigration. I always thought, good, we're not having children. We'll have to bring people in from somewhere
Yeah,
else. We need people to do the work here. My views have changed over time. I have to say, being exposed to some of the darker side that's come with that, and particularly the lack of integration with some groups, very noticeable, and their hostility and their hatred and bringing in people who don't have skills, so they become welfare dependent. That
yeah,
it's like madness. Why are you doing that? Bringing people to work, that's one thing. Bringing in people who effectively will be welfare dependent is such an own goal. I can't see any kind of rhyme or reason behind that. The church in Australia, actually, it's funny, the government and the church in Australia are in lockstep in so many ways because our government has been telling us for years we need to bring in lots more migrants. And the church is also saying, yes, if we bring in more migrants, there'll be more mass going Catholics. Because actually, as it so happens, we do tend to take quite a few migrants from places like Nigeria, and they do tend to be mass going Catholics, and Vietnam and the Philippines as well. That's
yeah,
that's that would be our biggest groups here. And that's fine, except I did the maths on this, and the Australian government would have to keep doing it at the same rate they're doing it until about 2050 for it to make a real difference to the church here demographically. In fact, if they did that, we'd have about 1 million new mass going Catholics, but 70% of them would be migrants. So can you imagine what a parish would look like, Larry? It would be just totally different by
yeah,
2050.
yeah.
Local born people would be a tiny minority. I think it would be quite cool in some ways because of the drums and the whole African thing. I don't mind that style of worship, but I can imagine a number of other people getting quite sniffy. Um, because
I don't
actually,
like it
a lot about
myself, but
yeah, yeah, yeah. I know. Well, you go to the Ordinariate though,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I
I'm
don't think
pretty,
they
I'm
have
pretty,
drums
I'm pretty high church stuffy.
there. Yeah, I don't. It's not such a bad thing. We have an ordinariate here. We have a small congregation here in Perth. So just so your listeners know, I'm in Perth, which is like San Francisco, and Sydney, which is probably the diocese in Australia with the most going on, and that's like New York. So I can't just pop over to Sydney and tell you how
Yeah,
everything's going.
yeah,
It is literally the other side of the country. Yeah, we have Sydney is like the flagship diocese in Australia in terms of recovery, because in Sydney they are actually recovering and they're getting converts and they're doing parish revitalisation and re-evangelisation. They're the only diocese I can think of that's really followed up on our ghastly plenary council that we had a few years ago that was
yeah. I want to talk
terrible.
about that. Yeah,
Oh, Larry, the worst people got hold of it. Exactly the people you don't want laying down the law for what the
Okay,
future of the church should look
before we get
like.
to that, I want to complete our discussion on demographics, and then I do want to
Yep.
move on to this issue of synodality and the plenary council
Yeah.
and what's going on theologically and ecclesiologically in Australia. But the demographics, I have a question. I mean, we can talk about the causes of the collapse of the birth rate amongst Catholics, and it's happened in the United States as well. It's happened in Europe. It's happened in Canada. Well, it's happening in Latin America now too. It's happening in Poland, of all
Yeah.
places. So this
Yep.
is a phenomena that's across the board. And so the question that arises in my mind is, okay, what is it about the modern world that leads people to want to have fewer and fewer children? It's almost as if the more affluent Catholics became, the more well off they became financially,
Yeah.
the bigger the houses they had, the fewer the
Mm.
children they had.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
answer is really strange. I also wonder, and you can comment on that, but then also wonder if urbanization doesn't have something to do with this. I don't know what it was like in Australia, but here in the United States, we had the phenomenon of Catholics arriving in the 19th century who were largely farming, who then
Hmm.
in the 20th century began moving into the factories, into the urban centers, and forming on, Irish enclaves, Italian enclaves in places like New York City, and so on. And so maybe urbanization has something to do with this. I don't know. So maybe you can comment on that.
Hannah's Children. I'm just Googling it now. Catherine Palakak's book, Hannah's Children, was excellent on this, on what does it take to get a woman to have a bigger family? Can a government pay her more? What do you have to promise her to get her to do this? And actually, the answers she came up with, because she interviewed a whole lot of women of all sorts of religious denominations who had had big families. Um, and what came back was that a woman has to do the math in her head. She has to do the cost benefit ratio, that what she invests, what those children represent as a future investment, outweighs the current cost of having the children. So you
Yeah.
have to persuade her that having a big family will pay in the long run in all sorts of ways, not just financially, but in terms of social support and grandchildren and love, and all of the kind of non-tangible things as well. It's not enough to promise her $1,000 if she'll have another baby, because that's just now. She has to see the future for those children and that child, and that's what's missing. And look, Larry, I put my hands up. I have not got a single child to my name, and that ship has
Yeah.
sailed. So there will be no children in this department. But, thankfully, I'm surrounded by people with big families. So I feel like they've made up, for my failure to produce a big family. And I come from a big family. I'm the youngest of 7 children. I've got 23 nieces and nephews. I've got great nieces and nephews. So, I've been really blessed in that respect. But younger Catholics are having more children and they are making those sacrifices, I think, but it's money, Larry. The cost of housing in Australia is beyond a joke at the moment because of our immigration problem. Because when you bring in adults, they need housing now. If you give birth to children, they live with you for 18 years before they need a house, or like 20 years, 25
Yeah.
years.
That's a problem.
Whereas you bring in adults now, they need the housing now, and then there's no housing. So,
And you have to have double income to afford the
yeah.
housing. And when you have
Yep.
double
Yep.
income, that means the wife is working
Yep.
or both spouses working, which means that
Yeah.
eventually you have to pay for daycare,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
also astronomically expensive.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
and and
And
so you get into this downward cycle of saying, well, okay, I can only afford one kid or two kids. That's
yeah.
it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yes.
And then you
Yes.
start thinking of college costs and so on and so forth.
Mm,
But
mm.
nevertheless, I also wonder if the demographic implosion doesn't have something to do with a spiritual implosion as well.
Oh, yeah.
That not
Mm.
only is modernity, more expensive than things used to be in terms of housing, and so there's economic pressures. It seems to me that though Catholics today are far more affluent than immigrant Catholics of the 19th century. And that didn't,
Yeah.
the economic constraints didn't stop Catholics of a bygone era. I remember I'm one of five. And my mom
Mm.
was a stay-at-home mom. My father was a firefighter in Lincoln, Nebraska, didn't make a whole lot of money. We couldn't afford a big house for those five kids and two adults. My dad bought a little cracker box ranch style house with three tiny bedrooms in it. All right, one bathroom. And there were
Yes.
monumental arguments over that bathroom as we got older and get everybody, my dad getting ready for work, my siblings getting ready for school. Well, my dad eventually did. He took some spike nails and he nailed some blankets up in the rafters in the basement and put two beds down there and said, "Okay, you boys, there were three boys. You boys, you're I don't care how you do it. You sleep down here. These are your bedrooms." In other
Yeah.
words, we made it happen. They didn't use the
Mhm.
excuse, "Oh no, we're," and now they're glad that they had those five kids. I remember, and I'm rambling now, and I'll get back to you. But I had a friend who had eight kids, and his daughter one day was confessing to him, "Oh yeah, I've had like four abortions, blah blah blah." She's like big liberal, woke, all this kind of, and he was very upset by that. And he says, "You don't want to have kids?" And she goes, "Well, I don't want to become a baby factory like mom was." To which this man, I was there, he turned to her and he said, "You know, which one of your siblings would you like me to give back?"
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
that really had an impact on her psychologically
Yes.
because she began
Yes.
to realize children are a gift. My siblings are a gift.
Yeah.
And so that's what
Yeah.
I mean by a spiritual implosion. It seems to
Mm.
me that back in the day, Catholics were willing to have more children because they saw children as a blessing from God. They saw
Yes.
children as something spiritual, even inchoately theological in a way. And now it's just
Yeah.
a cost benefit analysis. What do I get out of these
Absolutely.
kids? All right, anyway,
Yeah.
I'm rambling.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, seriously, you would like Hannah's Children. It's a good book, and but it's that she has to see the children as worth more than just the $1,000 now. And I think that's a fair enough thing. The younger Catholics who I know who are having the big families are surrounded by other young Catholics having big families.
Big,
You
yeah.
know, so there is that social support, the normalization of the bigger family, the normalization of the secondhand clothes, the meeting at each other's houses, because you're not going to go out to a restaurant or something like that. Um, a lot of things become normal, and then they're not scary anymore. And that is what the church hasn't been doing in Australia. I think we were very good at talking about marriage for the last 50 years. It's been like, got to get behind marriage. We all get that, but not so much around the children factor. And in fact, if anything, you have more than three children, people at church give you contraceptive advice. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
there's not that culture of the bigger family. It's almost like the church in Australia, I know, is too embarrassed to talk about children because it's like, well, we'll be accused of the baby factory thing.
Oh, yes, this is key. I know in the United States, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in the United States, anytime a priest or a bishop suggests that Catholics should focus on having larger families, he's accused the handwives' tale, and oh,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
want to
yes,
return women to barefoot and pregnant? How dare
yes,
you?
yeah,
How dare
yeah,
you do this? And he's
yes,
then
yeah,
portrayed as this fascist monster who just wants to
yeah.
generate women as you get the picture.
Mm. Yes, yeah, it is. It's really disheartening, So, but that's the devil at work. You can see why. But look, we had a treasurer back in the day, when Australia actually had a baby boom, in the early part of the 2000s because there was a baby bonus paid because the treasurer actually said, "We're in
Yeah.
demographic trouble. Have one for mum, one for dad, and one for the country." And it's like, well, couldn't we say one for mum, one for dad, and one for the church? It
Yeah.
no, nobody accused him of wanting to take us back to the dark ages. In fact, people leapt on that money and families did get bigger. And so having like three and even as many as four children in Australia outside of the church, that became much more normal. And again, people saw other people doing it. And it's like, oh yeah, I can actually do that. Making it possible, making it feasible. Um, if the church, it's funny, I do say this in my book. If we had swung behind Humane Vitae, and really went after the government for income splitting, tax breaks, cheaper housing, all of the things
Yeah.
that would have benefited not just Catholic families, but all families, we could have had a different country to live in, but we didn't. We all just walked away, and so now, of course, we have to reap the consequences of our actions. So, yeah, yeah, it's a kind of a grim picture.
Yeah, it is very ideological what happened as
Mm,
well, in the sense that it
mm,
was so tied up with feminism and women's liberation, so forth. Because I
mm.
mean, the government, although quite stupid many times, both in your country and mine, they're not they're not incompetent in
Mm,
this sense. They have accountants, they have actuarial type people who
yeah,
clearly could have said to them, "Look, you know what? You can encourage women to have only 1.5 children." But in 30 or 40 years, you're going to regret that decision as we have an aging population and fewer younger taxpayers. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, even strictly from an economic point of view, to so limit families. Forget the
yeah,
spiritual side. One begins to see that there was an ideology at work here.
yes, yeah. But
And
also
to
the
what
idea that we can
extent,
do,
this is my question to
yeah,
you. Let's get to the plenary council. To what
yes, plenary
extent
council.
did that secular ideology of feminist liberation and so forth leak into the Catholic Church in Australia? Because I know it's leaked into it here in the
Oh,
United States.
heaps, look, heaps. And that, when I was talking about the 1990s and the worst possible period, that when the worst possible people had their claws in our Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, they actually commissioned, at huge expense, a study called man and woman in Christ Jesus or something like that. And look, it purported to be a scoping of views of women's groups across Catholic Australia. And oddly enough, most of them wanted women's ordination, because
Yeah.
they went to
Oh,
a lot of
strange.
trouble to find
And gay
those
marriage.
people. Everything. So there was a lot of that. There has been quite a vocal, active movement within the Catholic Church in Australia, mostly like radicalized nuns, ex-nuns, lay women with theology PhDs who want something to do with them, who really have pushed quite actively for women's ordination. But I do think the group is quite small. I think a lot of them also have died, because
Yeah.
like demography is on your side here. And I don't like using the term biological solution, but actually it is kind of a solution.
Well, yeah. I
Um,
mean, one of the best
so
things
yeah,
that could
mm,
possibly happen is I got to be careful how I say this because it doesn't come out the wrong way because they were women who served the church admirably in many, many,
yes,
many
yeah,
cases. But one of
mm,
the downstream side effects of like the fact that most nuns are now 900 years old is that
yeah,
we are going to see a sea change in the
yeah,
mentality of
yeah,
young female religious from this older generation who are wonderful women, by the way. Just I met so many of them, and theologically, I
mm,
thought you're nuts, but just
yeah,
beautiful, wonderful, giving, caring women who
yes,
just were
yes.
not well formed intellectually and theologically.
No, no, and who were very easily led into awful
Yeah,
places, but
and
they're still
mistreated by the
there.
church
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
preconciliar era.
yes,
Very
yeah, yeah.
mistreated by the church in the
Mm.
preconciliar era.
Yeah, talked down to and belittled, and their
Yeah,
educational ambitions thwarted. I
yeah,
understand all of that. I was taught by nuns like this, so I totally get it. Having said that, the ones with the loudest voices who have entrenched themselves to in diocesan bureaucracies as
yeah.
well, and there was a group of them at the plenary council who, at the second like closing session, actually had a tantrum because the plenary council hadn't put through their proposals to open up the diaconate to women. And there was a terrible fight about this, and these women were crying and carrying on, because they had been led to believe all that time that they would get these motions through. Now, whoever led them to believe that is actually at fault here, and I suspect it was some of their male manipulators. But yet that happened, and that was horribly embarrassing. But at the same time, it was great because it took. It tore the veil down. It's like the gloves are off. Now we can see these people are actually trying to manipulate this process to produce a particular outcome for them, a particular political, liturgical, doctrinal outcome that was never the intention of the purpose. Maybe it was, I don't know, but certainly the church cannot do that. The plenary council didn't have the authority to do anything of the sort,
No,
and yet there they were, acting like it was like it was 1968. It's not
Yeah.
1968 anymore,
Yeah,
Larry.
no, yeah. Hello,
Oh,
1968 called. They want their lava lamp back. So, you know,
oh. And the
you know,
the
so it's,
paraliturgies, they did these paraliturgies with a paper plate and a little pile of dirt, and you can just imagine it was just awful.
oh,
So
it's like
so
when
there
I
was
was a
that.
kid,
Yeah,
when I was a kid,
yeah.
the DRE took all the holy water out of the fonts during Lent and put
Mm.
cacti in the holy water. Remember my father, the first day he walked
Oh,
into church and automatically he just reached to his right to stick his hand into the holy water font. And he went, oh, and I still remember this. We're in church. He goes, oh shit, it's a cactus. That I wish we could communicate to younger listeners the
oh,
lunacy, the sheer lunacy that we had
I
to live through.
the
And
war
so the
stories.
fact
I know.
is, your plenary council, and I thought
Mm,
this way about the Synod on Synodality, even in
yeah,
Rome. It's
yeah,
still
yeah.
explain this to me, Philippa, because you see it in Australia, so you can talk about it in Australia context. What is the power of the enduring power of this version of liberal progressive Catholicism, which is now sort of being clung to by an aging population? But why?
Oh,
Why? In other words,
Larry.
because let me finish one thing here.
Yeah,
Because there is a
yeah.
control in this experiment. It's called
Mm,
Protestantism. They've done
mm.
all this stuff already, and it hasn't stopped their
Yes,
decline. So,
yes,
what
yes.
is the power behind this ongoing narrative that if we just have women priests and married priests and gay marriage and contraception, everybody's going to come flocking back to church? Well, there isn't going to be
No.
anybody. Anyway, go ahead.
Look, no, I think you're right. Look, attention and relevance. I mean, these people, remember, Larry, they still describe themselves as the children of Vatican II. So they still think of themselves as very young and very with it and very right on. And, gabfests, these people are all retired now. They have time. They're not running a farm like you. They're not actually going to
Yeah.
work every day like me or raising a young family like everyone else I know. They've got time. They've got time to burn, these people, and they're sitting at home and they feel overlooked and irrelevant. And then someone says, hey, come and sit on this working party. Hey, come and get involved in this council and this, synod. And, you can do input, and people listen to you because you have these listening sessions where everyone gets listened to, even if they're talking complete malarkey, they get listened to. And that's like nectar for lonely old people. And that's who you get at these things. You look at the photos in the Catholic press, it's like, wow, that's like a retirement village
I
dining hall.
know. Yeah.
Wow. And there
Yeah.
they all are, being relevant and important. And that to me just tells us we don't look after our old people properly.
Yeah,
They're
I
lonely and
saw a
sad.
picture. I saw a photo of a so-called mass that was presided
Mm,
over by an invalidly ordained, American Catholic woman who was a priestess, and so she was holding mass in some dissident group's garage or
mm,
something, and the picture showed these folding chairs, and it was a congregation of maybe 15 people. They all looked like Methuselah. I mean, they all looked like they were
yeah.
95 years old, and I thought, what a sad picture this is. And so that's
It
Australia.
is. It is. And look, people get mad at me when I say this kind of thing. They say you're being so ageist. They're relevant. They have something to say. They should be listened to. I
Nah,
agree with
I'm
all of
old. I
that.
don't care.
But the church is not going to change its teaching just because you're lonely. Um, and by all means, maybe it's even safer to have them in these rooms having these big gab fests, and then everybody goes away feeling consulted. But as long as we don't actually act on anything that they
Yeah.
suggest, but the money that is spent on this as well, Larry, we never get to see the financials. That also annoys me. I still don't know how much it costs to run that plenary council, and I will never know because no one is ever going to tell me.
Yeah. So-called
It's
the
got to be
transparent.
several
Okay. So
million dollars. Yeah,
to what extent was the plenary council? I mean, your plenary council actually, I think the initial movement to have this plenary council started before the Synod on Synodality.
yes,
So
yes, it did.
it
Yeah, yeah.
actually began then, correct me if I'm wrong, as the local bishops of Australia taking their cue from Pope Francis and saying, "Hey, Francis talks a lot about a more synodal church and periphery, so let's have a synod." The Germans, maybe, in other words, is Australia reacting more to the German synodal vague than it
yeah.
is to the Roman synod on synodality.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was more inspired by what was going on in Germany, if anything. Look, I was invited to take part in it because somebody in Sydney, who I can't name, was actually trying to round up conservative Catholics to take part in this shambozzle in order to try and bring, a bit of sanity into it. And I said, look, I actually think this is evil. I think this whole thing has been conceived in evil. I think it intends harm for the church. And I am working, I'm studying part time. I'm trying to raise my nephew to adulthood successfully. I'm caring for two elderly parents. I have no time to go to 3-hour meetings where we're just going to sit around and talk and not achieve anything and do that over a period of 14 months. I cannot do that, and nor can anyone else I know. So that's how
Yeah.
it ended up with all the old people, of course. Um, yeah, that I believe it was conceived in evil, and I still believe that in my heart of hearts, which is why I wouldn't have anything to do with it. But I know God can bring good out of that, and I think He has in some places. Um, but really, when I read the opening documents for it, I thought, oh, look, fair enough. They've actually realized we've got real problems in the church. We've got a demographic huge shortfall of people. People aren't coming to mass. There are real problems. And it was originally set up to try and look at that, but that just went out the window. It's like the war between the liberals and the conservatives. They kept dragging the plenary council in different directions. And you watched it in the documents. Like you'd see, oh, here's a nice conservative document. And the next document would be complete lunacy. And then it would get dragged back onto
Yeah.
track again.
Yeah.
It was positively nauseating. I mean, I get motion sickness and I'm not good with this kind of stuff. So yeah,
That kind of
interesting
whiplash.
process.
You saw that in the
Yeah,
papacy of
yeah,
Pope Francis all the time. Francis would say one thing one day that was super orthodox, super conservative,
yeah,
even using horrible, terrible slang words to describe
yeah.
homosexuals, that normal people in normal conversation don't politely use anymore.
Yeah,
And yet,
yeah,
and then the next day he's saying lunacy, just
yes,
fiducia
yes,
supplicans and so on and so forth.
yes.
Okay,
Oh,
so
Larry, I'm just going to say this one thing now, and you can edit it out if you want to. I was relieved when he died because I thought I'll wake up tomorrow and there won't be something in the Catholic press that I have to explain to everyone. At
yeah,
last,
exactly.
at
Finally.
last.
No, no, I understand. I'm not going to edit that out because it's a sentiment that I think millions of
Yeah,
Catholics shared. And in order to put it in proper context, none of us wish suffering and death upon any human being. And
no.
it does, I don't like the fact at all that Pope Francis probably suffered terribly in his
Yes.
final
Yeah,
few months. One can't even imagine what he went through in the hospital, for example, with his
yeah,
various
yeah,
breathing crises and so on.
yeah.
So God bless him, and I pray for him, and I hope that he's on his way to heaven or in heaven. But
Oh,
there,
likewise.
but
Yeah.
he was 88 years old and in poor health.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you know what? And let's go to a pope I greatly admired, Pope John Paul II, who is still
Mm,
my biggest ecclesiastical hero of my life. I love Pope John Paul, despite his
yeah.
shortcomings. But I was
Yes.
relieved when he finally passed,
Oh,
because I thought
yes.
he's
Yeah.
old and he's suffering,
Oh,
and it would be a blessing if the Lord would just take him
yes.
peacefully. And so I felt the
Yeah.
same way about Pope Francis, but also this sense of,
Mm,
unlike John Paul, I did
relief.
not like Pope Francis. And so,
Mm,
a lot of people didn't like Pope Francis. And it wasn't just because, oh, he's too liberal. No, even liberal Catholics I know who worked in the Vatican and so forth said he's prone to temper tantrums. He's arbitrary. He's capricious. He'll say one thing one day and another thing the next. So
yeah.
there's a sense in which now with Pope Leo that it's a breath of fresh air, that a certain
Yes.
level of
Yes. Mm,
basic human decency has returned to the Vatican. Because,
yeah.
Pope Francis did not treat people well who worked for him, either in Buenos Aires or in Rome. And I know that
Yes.
for a fact from people who
Yes.
worked for
Yes.
him, and I'm
Yes.
sure you do
Yes.
too. So,
Oh,
let's
absolutely. Yeah.
let's not
Mm,
sugarcoat this. Let's not engage in false canonizations. He was a public
yeah.
figure. He was the Pope of our church, and we're perfectly allowed to assess his legacy. And his legacy overall was a train wreck, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute train wreck. And thank God for
Hmm.
Pope Leo, because I think he's going to try. I saw that, for example, Bishop Zanchetta, or Zanchetta, I think it's Zanchetta, the guy who covered up sex abuse and was accused of untoward manipulations of sexual manipulations of seminarians in Argentina, who was actually
Yeah.
convicted in Argentina, who's been allowed
Hmm.
by Pope Francis to essentially hide in Rome for the past 2 years. He has been he's back in Argentina, which tells me
Good.
that Pope Leo has quietly said to his underlings, get this guy back to
Yeah.
Argentina.
Yeah.
I think
The
this is a very,
party's over.
yeah,
The
yeah,
party's over. Good.
you know, so this all goes
Yeah.
back to what you were talking about with regard to your plenary council and the church in Australia, which is
Mm.
it's a microcosm of what's been going on in the broader Catholic Church now under the pontificate of Pope Francis and even beyond. You know, a liberal statement one day, a conservative statement that takes it away the next. Catholics
Mm.
need a surer foundation than that, don't they?
Yes, I would have thought so. And I love Pope Leo already because he gives major nerd vibe for me. It's like
Yeah,
he's, the
yeah,
maths degree and the logical thinking and stuff. And I think, oh, thank goodness. I hope he's Pope Nerd the First. I hope he's boring. I hope he's
yeah,
not a media star. I can't stand it. Whenever
yeah,
I used to watch Pope Francis and I used to think, you are acting. You are acting like you think the Pope should act.
yeah,
You're waving and you're kissing babies and you're doing all this stuff, and it didn't feel real. It never, John Paul II, it always felt real because you could see he was just that kind of man.
yeah,
Benedict the
yeah,
16th would wave, and it's like because he didn't want to kiss babies and so, and he didn't because that wasn't him. But with Francis, it always felt like PR to me, and I was very
yeah.
suspicious of it.
It's part of
Leo,
his image. Anyway.
I'm just hoping there's none of that. I hope he's the world's most boring pope because I could really handle that right now.
Well, I wrote an article in the Pillar in which I said, I hope he never writes an encyclical or issues a motu proprio or does an off the cuff interview on an airplane.
Mm,
I hope
yeah,
that he
yeah,
restores the papacy to its historical roots. And that is the Petrine ministry is a court of last appeal that
yeah,
unifies the church by clarifying matters that are in dispute. The papacy
yes,
was never intended to be the generator of novelties, the generator
yes,
of great ecclesial movements. That's never,
mm,
that's
mm,
supposed to bubble up from below. You talk about synodality, you talk about
yeah,
listening and dialogue and parrhesia and todos,
mm,
everybody. That has to bubble up from below. And this is
yeah,
the irony is that, like under John Paul, for example, who is now caricatured as this very by the left, as he was this authoritarian pope that Pope Francis lifted. The fact is, there was an explosion of ecclesial movements in the church
mm,
under John Paul II. And
yes,
explode even ones
absolutely,
that already
mm,
existed exploded in
yeah,
membership.
yeah,
So the irony is
yes,
that the supposedly authoritarian pope allowed ecclesial movements to bubble up from below, to inform the
mm,
church from below to the above. Whereas
yeah,
it seems like the pontificate of Francis was about creating the illusion of ecclesial vitality from a
mm,
top-down sort of PR, sort of synod on synodality, and all this. And it was like I agree with you. It just seemed stage
yeah.
managed.
Yes, yeah, didn't feel real at all. One of the in terms of like ecclesiastical movement and change, have you looked at because Robert Prevost, of course, was in charge of the dicastery for bishops
Yeah,
from the beginning of 2023 onwards. So the episcopal appointments in the United States, because I know you guys ran out of bishops
yeah,
at one stage. You had big shortfall and a lot of dioceses that needed new bishops. And everything seemed to stop under Francis. And around about 2020, 2021, all of those appointments seemed to sort of go into
yeah,
abeyance. And then Prevost came in 2023, the beginning of 2023, and things started moving again. Now, I know McElroy got Washington, but it is thought that came from pressure from the McCarrick bishops,
yeah.
wanting
It
another
did.
one of their own in that
It did.
role.
Everybody
But
I talked to has knowledge of that, says that Prevost was
yeah,
against it.
yes, yes, good, good. Because I've been looking at the appointments that he was involved in Australia, and they are good. They are
Yeah,
really good. When I look at there was an absolute flurry. We had a whole lot of dioceses that needed people. We've still got three that the bishops are over 75 and we're waiting. But the ones that he was involved in, or I think he was involved in, that I'm smiling, because I think they were really good choices. So that gives me a lot of confidence. I think he knows. He knows
yeah,
about Australia. I think he knows more about us than we think. And I think good. good. You're appointing good people. That's excellent.
Yeah, I think that one of the down what's the word? I'm the one of the downsides of
Mm,
the vocations crisis and the sex abuse crisis is that bishops are now faced with financial and personnel headaches that no bishop has ever had to deal with before. Millions
yeah.
and millions and millions of dollars in lawsuits, and then not enough priests. So you've got one priest running three parishes, and they're burning out, and they're giving you trouble from their end. All right. And
Mm,
so what we have now, Philippa, is the phenomenon. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I know in the United States, the crisis is this. More and more and more priests who are being asked to become bishops are saying no. So
yes, yes, I
your
read
your
about that.
best,
Yeah.
your best
Mm,
and your brightest are the ones that are being asked, and they are saying no, no way in hell.
mm,
Get somebody
yeah,
else to do that crazy job. And so
yeah,
you end up with slim pickings. You end up with slim
yes,
pickings. So I think Prevost did a pretty good job
yeah.
when he was head
But
of
I'm
the
also,
caster.
yeah, I'd also wondering though, now that Pope Francis has gone, because those young men would have seen things like removing Robert Barron, and sticking
Yeah.
him in a completely different place, and what happened to Joseph Strickland and all of that. And that would not have helped. Whereas perhaps now that Francis has gone, younger priests might be more willing. They might see Leo as a more reasonable boss, and they're less likely to be moved in an arbitrary way or punished, for saying the wrong thing and so forth. That maybe that's going to be a factor.
Yeah, I'm not a Bishop Strickland fan. I think he
Mm,
was a bull in a china shop. But I tell you what,
yeah,
I will also say he was not treated fairly. He was not
yeah,
treated with
yeah,
proper canonical decorum. I think he should still be the Bishop of Tyler, Texas. If Cardinal
yeah. With his
McElroy, who has publicly
declarations.
dissented from the church's teaching on sexuality, can become the Cardinal of Washington, D.C., are you kidding me? And we're going to
Yeah,
depose
yeah,
Bishop Strickland because he criticized the Pope? The
yeah.
Pope who said, "Hey, please criticize me. All voices are welcome." Oh, by the way, you're no longer a bishop. Okay, and
Oh,
so I
Larry.
feel I do, I think that
Yeah,
Bishop
yeah,
Strickland was wrongly deposed, and
yeah. So
that
do
is
I.
from someone who is not a fan of Bishop Strickland.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, he's
yeah.
Orthodox and all that, but I don't want to go down that path. But anyway, I want to get back to Australia. So
Yes,
we
yes.
we've talked about the demographic implosion. We've talked about which is all over the world now too. We've talked about the plenary council, which is sort of an Australian version of the German synodal vague and so on. But your book, let's get back to your book, goes, it talks about, what's it like, yeah, in the parishes of Australia? What's it like on the diocesan level of Australia? So you go through
Yeah, yeah,
all the chapters are logically laid out to sort of give a big picture of the church in
yeah.
Australia. So what is, other than the demographic implosion and the octogenarians who are still controlling things like the plenary, what is the state of the church in Australia? You mentioned there are young Catholics who are having more children and so forth. Um, is it a case of a smaller but more devoted church, or what's going
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, I think that's what we're looking at. I've tried to sort of take things forward to about 2050 because that's actually only 25 years away. It's not that far
Yeah,
away.
2050
Um,
is like the time here that you point towards.
Yeah, yeah. I think we will have half the number of mass going Catholics, but I think the Catholics who are coming to mass really believe. And that's something that Stephen Bullivant and I found out when we interviewed them, like we measured, we gave them the survey to do. The ones who come to mass really believe. And they don't have a problem with the church's teaching about a whole range of things. The people who identify as Catholic but never come near church do have problems. I think those people are not the future of the church. The future of the Catholic Church in Australia is the mass goers. And certainly, Stephen and I also found that it's the weekly mass goers who are doing all the heavy lifting in the parishes. They're doing all the voluntary work. They're keeping the show on the road, very much so. And again, these are people invested in the future of the church. And there's a whole range of ages there. So we still have quite a big old population and a sort of narrow stalk of people under the age of 70 kind of supporting it. Um, I can't see that getting bigger, but I think these people will be very committed and they will really stick with the church. But our parishes are going to have to be shaken up a lot. We actually have the situation, Larry, in Australia where we're going to run out of laity before we run out of priests. We have no priest shortage at all. in Australia. And this was
Interesting.
one of like the untouchable myths of the church in Australia in the 1990s, was that we were going to run out of priests tomorrow. So we had to ordain women now and ordain married men now because there was a crisis. And actually, it's complete and utter bullshit. We're going to run out of labour
Yeah. Yeah.
way before. Got tons of priests. It's about one for every between 150 and 200 Catholics, mass going
Wow.
Catholics in
That's
Australia. Yeah,
crazy.
mass going Catholics, because I don't count non-mass going Catholics because priests don't work with them. They work with mass going Catholics. It's about, yeah, at the worst, it's about 1 to 350, and that's in the Diocese of Parramatta, which is an inner city diocese where, like, you could walk to another church from your church. If your priest was sick that Sunday, you could probably walk around the block and there'd be another Catholic church there, and a priest would be there. So not a problem. Not a problem. In rural and remote areas, there are problems with getting enough priests out there, absolutely. But that's because there's hardly any Catholics there, and they're spread really, really thinly. I mean, Australia's a really big country. It's as big as the continental United
That's true
States.
wherever there are vast
Yeah,
expanses. We see it in the United
yeah,
States. You see it in Africa. Wherever there's like
yeah.
vast expanses and few Catholics, it's, yeah, you're going to have a
Mm,
hard time finding sacraments. And that is
yep,
probably a
absolutely.
phenomenon that goes back to the earliest church,
Yep, yeah, yeah,
in areas where there were very few Catholics, yeah, it's going to be hard to
mm,
find the sacraments.
yeah. But most Catholics in Australia we've got about half of all the mass going Catholics in Australia live in just 4 archdioceses. And we've got 28 dioceses in Australia, but only 4 of them really, really matter because that's where most of the mass going Catholics are. We are a very urban church. We're a very urban population in Australia. We live in the cities and we hug the coast of the country because that's where all the nice beaches are and it's beautiful. And we all love an ocean view. But yeah, outside of that, it can be a bit problematic. But we have tons of priests. And in fact, we're getting more ordinations now than we have had in a long time. The curve of ordinations is on the way up, which is great. And these are all, younger guys and keen, devout, lots of adoration, well formed, wanting to be well formed. Most of them, like, keen to learn more about the church. I don't know about the quality of seminary formation. I think it's a bit uneven across Australia. Some places are definitely better than others, but they've had record numbers in the seminary in Sydney. They've got a good crop of seminarians in Melbourne at the moment too. So, yeah, priests, not a problem. Lay people, bit of a problem. So, it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I've heard, I have some priest friends here in the United States who have said similar things that,
Yeah.
look, the fact is vocations have decreased, uh,
Mm,
not because of women's ordination or their non-ordination or whatever, but simply because in many ways the bottom has fallen out of Catholic culture in the United States.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
therefore the incentive to become a priest is much less. But
Yeah.
by the same token, the fact that the culture has fallen apart, the Catholic, means that there's fewer and fewer laity, that they're
Yeah.
walking away from the church in
Yeah.
droves and droves, and we're hemorrhaging young people in the United States in particular.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that raises to me an interesting question about the church in Australia, because it pertains to the church in the United States as well. And we can tie this into as well maybe a discussion of the the liturgy and the traditional Latin Mass and trads and so forth.
Yeah.
In this
Yeah.
sense, there is a narrative out there that says, and I just saw Bishop Barron say this the other day in his interview with Tucker Carlson, that there is an upsurge of young people coming into the Catholic Church and that it is a fairly conservative clientele, if you want to put it that
Mm,
way, that's coming into
yeah.
the church.
Yeah.
And of course,
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
have friends like my friend, and he is a friend, Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. That's how you pronounce his name. Who writes a lot. They talk about, oh, you go to these Latin masses and they're full, they're full, they're full. But my thinking is, well, that's a niche market, and they're few and far between. And so, yeah, you
Yeah.
go to one and it's going to be full. But is that so? My question to you is, what is it that young Catholics are looking for in Australia? What is drawing
Yeah.
them back to the church? What kind of Catholics
Yeah.
are they? What kind of liturgy do they want?
Yeah, yeah. Look, our younger Catholics are more conservative as well. And something that Stephen Bullivant and I found in the survey that we did back in 2022 was that the people we spoke to weren't exclusive TLM. they weren't exclusive Latin mass goers. They tended to alternate between the traditional Latin mass and the Novus Ordo. So there wasn't like, a very,
Yeah.
very isolated, walled off camp of people who just, didn't want to go near the Novus Ordo. Um, and they were younger. And in fact, a lot of the converts who we found in the survey, I think about 20% of them were Latin mass attenders, which was really interesting. So, because I didn't expect to see that in the
Yeah.
findings at all. So they are more conservative. They like a more sane liturgy. They actually like traditional devotions. They go to stuff. They go to adoration. They go to rosary walks, and they go to, events that get held across Australia. They go on the Corpus Christi processions in the capital cities. They're prepared to go out there. They go on demonstrations outside Parliament houses whenever there's legislation that's anti-life. They go there in droves to that, which is really wonderful to see these young people. They're not afraid to be seen as Catholic, to embrace their Catholic weird and actually put it out there in the public forum. There are always the people who are into cosplay. You're
Yeah.
always going to get
Yeah.
those ones, and like the ones that want to dress up, and the ones
Tweed
for whom
jackets
nothing
and
is
pipes and beards and all that stuff. Yeah.
the whole thing, and
The whole
and
Chesterton look.
nothing is ever good enough for them either, I have to say. No liturgy is good enough and no parish is good enough. They tend to be a bit like the Princess and the Pea, with the
Yeah.
liturgy. But yeah, the ones who I know are not, exclusive Latin mass goers. I mean, in Australia we have Latin mass communities, but they vary from state to state in terms of, I suppose, their quality, their pastoral abilities, their social life, the sort of social support that they offer. We had a great community here in Perth, but unfortunately, the chaplain of it was completely and utterly identified with the community. And when he was disciplined by our Archbishop, to whom he had sworn allegiance, and fidelity, he disobeyed him completely and split and took a small congregation with him. And he's now, going his own way and saying his
Yeah.
own Latin Mass wherever. But what remained of the community is actually rebuilding without him, which is beautiful to see. And they have lovely priests, doing lovely masses, and they're rebuilding all of the social networks and things. And I love to see that, because that could have killed that community
Yeah.
stone dead, but it didn't, which is a really good sign. Look, in Brisbane, they have an oratory in formation, which is wonderful. They say the traditional Latin Mass there. They have a wonderful social program. Oratories always do. They always have massive stuff going on in the parish, and apparently that's really going well. The FSSP has a community in Sydney, which, I hear good things about that. The Melbourne Latin Mass community is actually diocesan. It's been established by the bishop, and I've met people who have left that community because they don't like the way it's run. So, I think it's like everything. There's good people, there's not so good people. People have good and bad experiences in it. Um, I was actually just talking about this afternoon with Stephen Bullivant, because we were having a meeting about Traditionis Custodes and how that actually happened. Because I will always maintain to my dying day that Pope Francis was acting on information about traditional Latin Mass communities in Spanish-speaking countries only. Because I think the Latin Mass movement in places like Costa Rica or potentially Argentina, etc., was probably a lot worse than what we've seen in the United States and in Australia. That,
Worse in what
Stephen,
way?
Steve, more like neo-Nazis,
Yeah.
more like
Well, I was just
like
about to
bad
ask you the
tradition.
question
Yeah,
because there is a strain of
yeah,
this sickness in the
yeah.
American traditionalist movement, and I know I'm going to get nasty emails now. That's not
Oh
all
no,
of
the
us.
the,
Okay, it's not
the
all of you.
anti-Semitism.
The
Oh, I can't stand it.
anti-Semitism
Mm,
and the
mm,
misogyny.
yeah, yeah,
Misogyny, and like in our ordinariate parish where I
yeah.
attend, I know several women who used to attend a traditional Latin Mass
Mm,
community who said, I just could no longer tolerate the attitudes towards women
yeah,
in those congregations.
yeah,
Likewise, the anti-Semitism is through the roof.
yeah,
Jews this,
yeah.
Jews that.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, I imagine the Traditiones Custodes perhaps
Mm,
had that in mind. But
yeah,
there's
yeah.
also, look, there's anti-Semitism
Mm,
on the left. And
Yes,
you
yes.
don't see the equivalent of traditionis custodes coming down on
Mm,
leftist liturgical aberrations and
yeah.
communities that harbor pro-abortion,
Mm,
anti-Semitic. I mean, come on. I mean that's not a problem
yeah.
with them.
Yeah.
So to me, the problem with Traditionis Custodes and the entire Francis pontificate is it seems to me that he had a no enemies to the left of me mentality. That he was
Mm,
very, very, very quick to see problems on the right and very quick to
mm,
move against the problems on the right. Okay, God bless him. Yeah, but
mm,
in
mm,
all of his talk about parrhesia and dialogue and reaching out to the
mm.
peripheries and todos, why not, instead of a synod on synodality, have a synod on the liturgy and bring
Yeah.
all of these various groups that you're talking about together to
He
actually
wasn't
have
interested in that.
to have a to have the
Mm,
Cirque du Soleil liberal,
yes.
let's have trapeze artists at mass
Yeah.
types there, and then let's
Mm,
have the Costa Rican fascist liturgy people
yeah.
there,
Yeah.
and the Peter
Yeah.
Kwasniewskis and the James
Mm.
Martins. Let's bring everybody together in one room,
Mm.
lock the door, and have you guys talk about liturgy. Because
Yeah.
is there
Yeah.
not a bigger festering wound in the church? And I say this over and over and over
Yes.
than the liturgy wars.
Mm.
After all, Vatican II did describe the Eucharist as the source and summit of our very lives. And we talked
Absolutely.
earlier about it's hard to get the sacraments in rural areas, which is why
Yeah. Yeah.
Catholicism quickly became an urban phenomenon in many, many, many ways, because it
Mm.
is a religion of sacraments, damn it. And that
Yeah.
requires
Yeah.
priests. Okay. And
Yep.
that means the liturgy is of central importance. And it's the
Yes.
one issue that the church is simply allowed to fester. I think Pope Benedict tried to do something about it with Summorum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Traditionis Custodes always then struck me as okay, yeah, there's problems in the trad movement. No doubt about
Mm.
it. There's all kinds of problems. All
Yeah.
right. But
Yeah.
let's not try to solve this problem by
Mm.
authoritarianly putting a lid on it, because you're going to pick at that scab forever, buddy, until you heal the
Yeah.
wound that's
Yeah.
underneath. Anyway, I'm
Oh,
on a
look,
rant now.
no, no, Larry, I agree with you. A priest who I spoke to, a traditionalist priest, and I actually have this in the book. It's a quote at the end. He has a parish there, very traditionalist, and he has this, little stream there that is problematic, and he talks about pastorally managing that you actually work with those people in the parish and you keep working with them and you keep at it so that eventually, with any luck at all, they integrate into the rest of the church. They realize they're
Right.
being too extreme. You can do it. It takes time and patience, but you don't achieve that if you send all the trads somewhere else. You actually put them off in a little quarantine area, and then no one can minister to them. No one can evangelize them. No one can kind of bring them back in to the church,
It
which
just
it's actually kind of
radicalizes
wrong.
them.
Yes, makes it
It
way
red
worse.
pills them.
Way
I
worse.
mean, it's
Mm,
it's like, the more persecution that comes their way, the more it
yeah.
simply confirms their own
Yes.
ecclesial narrative of the
Yes.
usurpation of proper Catholicism by these liberal prelates and
Yes.
so on. Uh,
And yep. Yep.
you probably get the same thing. I get emails
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
Everybody knows I'm a communio theologian, a ressourcement guy. I'm not a
Mm,
trad. I'm not a progressive. I'm
yeah.
not a neocon. I'm a communio guy. Okay, everybody knows that. And I get emails and I'm hard on progressives, but I'm also hard oftentimes on trads. I get emails all the
Mm,
time from people saying, you know what? I was borderline sede vacantist. I was blah, 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 this that I learned in the trad movement. But it's actually listening to your podcast and reading your articles that I have come to believe that that's too extreme. So that goes to your comment, Philippa,
good.
that,
Good.
all right. And that's because I've never said these people should, like the nitwits over at the blog thing
Yes.
where Peter is. These people should just be
Mm,
kicked out of the church. These people should just be
yes.
suppressed. Let's
Yes.
off with their heads. That's not
No.
the way to deal with your
No.
fellow Catholics. It's not the way to deal with
Yes.
it. All right. I
Yes.
just like I
No,
don't think Father James Martin should be excommunicated. I don't think so. These are
Yeah.
fellow Catholics who simply have
Yeah.
different points of view. Let's talk about those. Let's
Yes.
have real parrhesia. Anyway,
Yes, yeah, no, look, I agree with you. I mean, I used to be such a trad. I was going to Society of St. Pius X masses at one stage in my life. I've run the whole gamut right through this, and I have a lot of affection for the traditional Latin Mass, particularly the Low Mass. because of the silence. It's
Yeah.
and it was actually going to low mass that helped me see the relationship between the old mass and the new mass, because the low mass is actually quite similar to the Novus Ordo. I've been to Novus Ordo set in Latin with bells and smells. It's fabulous. I've been to Eastern liturgies. I've actually shopped around quite a lot. And to be honest, I have come to the point now where I realize there is a Mass of the Ages, but it's not the TLM. The Mass of the Ages is actually what's in St. Justin Martyr. It's what he describes, that sequence. And you'll find that in every form of the Mass in the
That's right.
world, whether it's the Holy Kurbana or the Byzantine Rite, or what the Maronites do, or the Novus Ordo, or the TLM. That's the Mass of all ages. It's that core string of things. So I don't get hung up about it anymore, because actually I know why I go to mass. But it took me a long time to get there. And so I get impatient now with trads. I have to be very careful when I engage with them. I've recently just epically beclowned myself because I lost patience with someone, and really gave him, I'm afraid, the rough end of my tongue on Facebook about him being what I call being precious about the kind of mass he wants to go to. But
Yeah.
it's just like, it's a bit like a bitch slap, and I'm hoping it was more like the Lord giving him a bitch slap through me than me just epically beclowning myself with losing my temper. But it is hard. It's hard to be patient and to remember what it was like to be that person when you were stuck worrying about whether Jesus is in the tabernacle or not, because you didn't know if the mass was valid or not. Look, to be honest, Larry, back in the 90s, when I was hanging around the Ecclesia Day crowd, I wondered why I couldn't get a date. And it was because they were all gay. You know, and it took me a while to kind of for that to dawn on me. So
Yeah.
there's that problem as well. There's all kinds of things there that need the love of God, and they need, the generous mercy and great love of Jesus to be poured in there. But my goodness, these people all hold it off sometimes. It's like, no, I don't want Jesus. I want lace.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you need
Yeah.
Jesus, not
I just
lace.
want the ledge. Well, it's funny you mention that because when I was in seminary from 1978 to 1985, uh, uh, the fact is the lacy guys, the guys who I mean, they're a senior in college or first theology and theologate, because I went to college
Yeah.
seminary too. And they say, "Come in here, I want to show you what I just got." And they open their closet, and their closet is already full of fiddleback chasubles and
Yeah.
lacy
Mm,
surplices and
mm,
Saturno hats, and you realize,
mm.
holy crap. And I thought,
Oh,
where'd you get all this stuff? Well, my aunt ordered this from a place in Rome, and now look at it. Blah, blah. I'm telling you, Philippa,
oh,
you're so right. I would say 90% of the men I encountered in the seminary who are of that
mm,
type were gay. Were just straight
absolutely.
up gay
That
men.
it
You talk about
the hats.
cosplaying.
Oh,
Yes.
the hats finish me. I can tolerate a lot in clerical dressing up, but the hats, they just finish me every time. It's like, are you kidding me? You look like a tit. You're going round, you look like
Yeah.
a complete fool. Really,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
not necessary. This is not necessary. I mean, but I get it. And sometimes it's a maturity thing. They need to go through that phase, and then they sort of work it out. And as they become a more mature priest, they realize that they're acting like a tit,
Yeah.
and then they start being more normal. So
And
yeah,
here's the deal that you confront them about this because I confronted young. He was wearing a Saturno hat, prayed and walking around downtown in a cassock and a Saturno hat. And a nice guy. I know him. He's really a great
yeah,
priest. He's a good
yeah,
guy,
yeah,
but it's a maturity issue. You're right. But,
yeah.
we were having coffee. I just cheekily said to him, what's with the hat and so on. He goes, well, here's what a Saturno hat symbolizes and blah, blah. And that's all
Oh,
true. That's all true. But the fact of the matter is this: when you have to explain a symbol, it's no longer a symbol. All
yes,
right. And so, in other
yes,
words, if you have to give me a 3 minute long dissertation on the theology of the Cisterno hat to explain why it is you're walking down a downtown street, everybody's looking at you like you're an.
yeah.
In other words, too, there's something to be said about Saint Simon the Stylite types, where you're a kind of a provocation in a good sense, where people say, "Look at that, that's
Mm,
interesting." But there's also what
mm,
I call bad weird, where people just look at
yes,
you and say, "That's just stupid. What the hell is
yes,
that? Who's he?" Wait a minute,
yes.
is this 1948? What the hell?
Mm.
And
And
so I know that's
it's
a
like, but look at
subjective
me.
assessment and we're
Yeah.
being kind of harsh here, but I think you're exactly right. I think I don't lay that at the feet of traditionalism.
Yeah.
I lay that at the feet of maturity. I really do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is like when they look like they've escaped from a BBC drama. It's always a bit of a worry. Bless their hearts, but they are.
Yeah,
They're good. They're good, and they want to be good, and they want to look like priests. And it is like they've just got to grow up a little bit more. And sometimes going to a really crappy parish somewhere, sometimes that straightens them out.
yeah.
All kinds of good can be done.
And I'm
But
not here to
yeah,
condemn them. You know what? Just like the old
yeah,
nuns, liberal nuns, I'm not here to condemn them. They're good women in their
yeah.
own way. And these young guys, God bless them for becoming priests. God bless them. But,
Oh, and
and I say this when I was a young seminarian, I was a fire breathing little mini me Torquemada looking for heresy
oh,
everywhere, but
you
I grew
sounded
out
like a
of it.
real pain.
Oh, I
Yeah,
was
when
a
I read
total
about it,
annoying.
when you,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. I was probably so annoying to my professors.
That's a heresy. Heresy. It said in the Council of Florence in 25, the canon
I look,
27.5.
It's like, holy crap-o-matic, shut up.
yeah,
You could just say they wanted to blow my head off. All right. And then
yes.
I
I
gradually
was,
much
yeah.
anyway, go ahead. I'm
I,
talking too
I,
much.
it's okay. No, you're not, Larry. I was very similar. I was a female version of that. It's like bam, 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 because religion was weaponized, in my family home,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And, you learn this is fun. I can talk about God and punish people at the same time. Hey, seeing as we're alienating everybody, let's talk about mantillas.
Well,
Funny
a
topic we
few,
haven't covered.
it's funny. There are a few women in my parish that wear them in the
Mm,
ordinary, but
yeah.
most don't. And I know
Yes.
Carrie, my wife,
Mm,
she's PhD in theology. She's the dean of a seminary. She toyed with the idea of wearing a mantilla, and she wore it a couple times. She goes, you know what? Yeah, it's like show off. It's not me. This is not right.
yes.
I don't like it at all. And so she doesn't
Yeah.
wear one. And
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. It's I because the idea was to cover your head. It wasn't to wear a mantilla, it was to cover your head. So
yeah.
theoretically you should have been able to put a handkerchief on your head or a hat
Or
or a
just a hat.
beret or anything anything like that. But it was abrogated by the Second Vatican Council. So I don't feel any obligation to do anything of the sort. But I tried it, of course, in my trad phase, and I've got no hair and it would slip off. And it was just, again, it wasn't me. But I have met younger Catholic women and when you were talking about the hat, that's what reminded me of it because they will give me a 3-minute explanation of veiling, the tabernacle. And it's a symbol of me, submitting myself to God. Again, there's a big, long explanation. And there's a real theology of veiling that seems to have emerged from I have no idea where, because that was not around when my mum was going to mass and had to wear a hat. No one was
Yeah.
talking about, oh, it's a symbol of me, I'm like the tabernacle and things like that, because she actually just had to wear a hat because St. Paul said. St. Paul doesn't talk about, it's like there's none of that. So I don't know where this theology of veiling. I, I I know in some Protestant communities that goes on, and I'm wondering if that's one of the things that's crept into Catholicism via the wonderful world of the internet because, people have read about
Well,
this
yeah.
theology.
There's the
And yeah, I'm
scriptural
just
thing about
wondering.
women covering their
Mm,
heads,
yeah,
lest they seduce angels or something, you know.
yes, yes. I also have no
Um,
hair. I've had short hair most of my life. I've got nothing to cover. So,
yeah,
it's
like
kind of
once
weird.
again though, if a young priest wants to wear the Saturno hat or whatever,
Mm,
fine. I
yeah,
think it's immature, and if a young woman wants to veil because in her mind it's a sign of
yeah,
consecration to God and it's deeply
yeah.
meaningful to her, yeah, I'm
Have at
so
it. Mm,
over the what I call the liturgical slapdown.
yeah,
Where the idea
yeah.
is no, you can't have an altar rail because that's
Ah,
not a uniform,
yes.
blah blah blah. No, you can't do mass ad
Yeah,
orientem, and no, young lady, you cannot wear a mantilla, and no, you cannot
yes,
kneel for communion, and no,
yes.
and I'm just tired of the finger wagging. I'm tired of the
Yeah.
ideology. I'm tired of it. Tired of it, I tell you.
Yes, I can sense that you're. Yeah, tell me what you really think, Larry.
Jeez.
Seriously, it's this Bishop Martin thing. This is such a good opportunity to talk about where a bishop's authority begins and ends with his
Yes.
people. Because I don't think that has ever been really clearly delineated, has it?
One of the things that got
Since
leaked
Vatican
was
II.
that he was contemplating even telling all of his priests, even the Novus Ordo ones, what they could and could not pray in the sacristy before they went out to say, you can't say your vesting prayers. Don't say your vesting
Yeah,
prayers. That's old church.
yeah,
You talk
yeah,
about a violation of canonical rights. I
Mm.
don't think a bishop has
Yes.
any
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
to tell a priest that he cannot say vesting prayers in the
Yeah.
sacristy.
I
I know
wouldn't have
the
thought so.
bishop has final authority over the liturgy in his diocese, but that's not authority over the liturgy. That's authority over the internal prayer life of a priest.
Yeah.
And if he's
Yeah.
praying to Satan, yeah, okay, say you shouldn't pray to Satan. But he's not. He's
Yeah.
praying
Mm.
prayers that priests prayed in the church for a millennia. Okay,
Yes.
and just
Yeah.
come in and say you can't do those anymore speaks once again. This is that ideology I'm talking about. We
Yeah.
need a healthy dose of liturgical pluralism right now to, in a sense, bring
Yeah.
healing and unity to the church. That's my point.
And we had it. We had it under Benedict the 16th, because I saw altar
Yes.
rails starting to appear, priests starting to, experiment with ad orientem. It was great, and people alternating between the TLM and the Novus Ordo. Healthy cross-pollination was happening. And then under Francis, we just lost it. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Leo's much into the liturgy. I just,
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope he's not going to kick it down the road, kick this
Well, we
can
need
down the road any
leadership from
further.
Rome. We need leadership from
Yeah.
Rome because here in my diocese of Scranton, Pennsylvania, the bishop forbids priests from putting in altar rails in their parish. He forbids it. And yet here, my dear friend, very good friend, old seminary classmate, Bishop James Conley of Lincoln, Nebraska, my hometown, has now ordered that if you're going to do any renovations of the sanctuary in your church or you're going to build a new church, you have to put in an altar rail, which I support. I think that's great. I
Yeah.
support Father
Yeah.
Conley. But nevertheless, look at the lack of uniformity there. Now, in
Mm,
one sense,
mm,
okay, let's have a healthy theological pluralism. I just called for that. In another sense, though,
yeah.
we need more direction from Rome as well.
Yeah.
We need Rome to come forward with sanity, not with a traditionis custodes slapdown, but sanity. That's, we let's have a set of liturgical norms come forth that are very expansive, that allow for a lot of this pluralism to happen, but within certain parameters. What do you think of that?
It will be interesting to see who Leo appoints to the dicastery of the discipline of the sacraments. That's going to be, I think that could be, if it's someone who is prepared to entertain this, it's going to also be interesting to see if Leo is a good delegator. And I'm hoping he is because Francis was not. Francis was a do-it-yourself guy, which is how we've ended up in such a mess. But
Yeah,
if Leo can pick the right person for that dicastery, and then that dicastery does its job, and actually starts addressing some
yeah,
of these problems, that would be wonderful. That would be, I read the most interesting, speaking of delegation and leadership in the church, George Pell of happy memory actually thought that Benedict the 16th was not a good picker of people to delegate to. He was a very holy man, and
yeah.
he did a great job, but that he tended not to pick the right people when it came to delegating, and that's such an important part of leadership
It's
to
huge
be a
part.
good pick. And yeah, absolutely. And John Paul II was a great delegator and picked good people, but Benedict not so much. So, and Francis not at all. So hopefully, I think that's probably what you need to keep an eye on for there. That's what I'll be looking out for. Because yeah, I agree with you. I think this conversation is long overdue.
It really is. Well, I think on that note, we've been at this about an hour and a half now. It just time has flown. I cannot recommend more because, it might seem like we didn't talk enough about the book specifically, but all of the issues we discussed
Yeah,
today
yeah,
are pertinent to this book. And why you should care about the church in
mm,
Australia, other than the fact that there are good Catholics there, and my friend
yeah,
Tracy Rowland as well is there, and Tom
yes,
Gourlay and
yeah,
a few others, is
yeah,
is that it's very very similar to what's going on in every church in the Western world. And your analysis, I'm glad you draw on Stephen Bullivant. Who, Stephen, once again, if you're listening, thank you for all your hard work and the sociology of all of this. Such a fascinating,
yeah,
important topic. Thank you
yeah,
for joining us. Oh, by the way, I should mention again, because not everybody's watching. The title of the book is Witness, The Future Catholic Church in Australia by Phillipa Martyr. Phillipa with two P's after the I, Phillipa Martyr. And on Facebook, you simply go by Philippa Joan.
yep. And the book is available on Amazon. Just give it a Google. It is very reasonably priced. You get a lot of bang for your buck with this book.
Bang for your buck. There you go. That's how we'll title this YouTube video, maybe, is Bang for Your Buck. Anyway, hey, thanks so much. We'll have to have you on again. This was a blast. I could
Thank
talk
you,
to you
Larry. No, it's
for 3 hours.
good.
You know, it's great. All
This
right.
is good, but you've got goats. You've got stuff to do.
And you've got to go to bed. So,
Yes, I do.
all right. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks everybody for listening. Bye now.
Yeah.